She had flown before, plenty of times. Propeller planes across the country, once even across the Atlantic. She knew what flying felt like. The gradual rumble of takeoff, the slow, patient climb, the predictable sounds of a machine working hard but within limits she understood. Then the 707's engines lit up behind her. And she told her daughter, decades later, that in that moment, just that moment before the brakes released, she genuinely considered getting off the plane. She didn't. She stayed. She arrived safely. She flew jets for the rest of her life without incident. But that moment at the end of the runway in 1959 never entirely left her. The feeling that something was about to happen that the human body simply wasn't designed to survive. She wasn't alone, not even close. To understand why the 707 frightened people so deeply, you have to understand the world those people lived in and what flight meant to them before the jet age arrived and changed the terms of everything. The 1950s in America were a decade of carefully managed optimism. The war was over, the economy was expanding, families were moving to suburbs, buying televisions, taking vacations. The future in the cultural imagination of that moment was something bright and attainable, not threatening, not alien, but continuous with the present. Progress was expected to arrive gradually, in increments, in ways that could be absorbed without shock. Commercial aviation in that world occupied a specific and well-understood place. Flying was for the prosperous. A ticket cost roughly what a working man earned in a month, and it carried the glamour of that exclusivity. The aircraft themselves were beautiful in a way that felt human in scale. The Lockheed Constellation with its triple tail and dolphin curve fuselage, the Douglas DC-7 with its polished aluminum skin catching light on the ramp. These were machines that looked like they belonged in the sky. Graceful, proportionate, visually legible in their relationship to the forces they were managing. Inside, the experience was luxurious by the standards of the era, though it came with significant physical costs that passengers had learned to accept as simply part of what flying was. The vibration of four-piston engines was constant and felt throughout the entire airframe, not alarming because it was familiar, but real and persistent. The noise in the cabin required raised voices for conversation. At altitude, pressurization imperfections left passengers with sinus pressure and mild headaches that cleared usually sometime after landing. Long flights were genuinely tiring in a physical way that had nothing to do with sleeplessness. None of this was considered a problem. It was considered flight. It was what flying felt like, and the people who flew regularly had calibrated their expectations around it, with the pragmatic acceptance that experienced travelers develop toward unavoidable discomfort. The fear that existed around flying in this era was also calibrated to this reality. People were afraid of engine failures, visible, understandable, the kind of failure where you could see the propeller slow and feather and know specifically what had gone wrong. They were afraid of weather, of turbulence, of the long, dark stretches of ocean on transatlantic crossings, where the nearest runway was measured in hours rather than miles. These fears had a shape. They were fears about known risks and known categories. Then came the jet age, and it arrived not gradually, not in the incremental way that the culture of the 1950s had taught people to expect progress, but all at once, fully formed, incomprehensibly fast. One year, the fastest thing in commercial aviation was a propeller aircraft doing 300 miles an hour. The next year, the 707 was doing 550. One year, a transatlantic crossing took 14 hours. The next, it took 7. The change was so abrupt, so total, that the psychological infrastructure that people had built around the experience of flying, the familiar fears, the familiar comforts, the familiar understanding of what the sounds and sensations meant, was simply abolished. Overnight. And into that abolished familiarity stepped something that looked from a distance reassuringly like an airplane, but that up close, and especially at full power, felt like something else entirely. What people felt at the end of that runway in 1958 and 1959 was not irrational. It was the completely reasonable response of human beings whose experience had just become irrelevant. The 707 terrified people for specific, physical, documentable reasons. It wasn't an impression or a cultural anxiety. The aircraft generated fear through its actual behavior, through what it did to the senses of everyone who experienced it for the first time. And to understand the fear, you have to understand exactly what the 707 did that nothing before it had done. Start with the sound. The engines of a propeller aircraft, four radial piston engines producing enormous power, make a sound that the human body recognizes at some deep level as mechanical work being performed. There is rhythm to it, there is a pulse. Your body understands intuitively that there are cylinders firing in sequence, that there is a mechanical logic underlying the noise, that what you're hearing is a machine doing something comprehensible. The Pratt & Whitney JT3 turbojets on the early 707 made a sound that had no precedent in civilian experience. It wasn't rhythmic, it didn't pulse, it built, from a whine to a roar to something that stopped being sound in the ordinary sense and became pressure, physical pressure, something you felt in your chest and your ears and the back of your throat simultaneously. Passengers who experience the 707 engine run-up at close quarters for the first time consistently describe not just hearing it, but being physically affected by it in ways they hadn't anticipated. The smell was another thing nobody had prepared them for. Jet exhaust in the 707 era had a sharp, kerosene-heavy character that was quite different from the exhaust of piston engines, which passengers at propeller-era airports had grown accustomed to as simply part of the ambient smell of aviation. The jet's exhaust was stronger, more chemically present, and it arrived with the sound in a combined sensory package that some passengers found genuinely overwhelming before they'd even boarded. Then the takeoff roll. On a propeller aircraft, the acceleration builds over a long runway roll with a gradual progression that gives passengers time to adjust psychologically to what's happening. The sounds increase, the vibration increases, the runway lights begin moving faster. The entire process has a duration, long enough that your mind can follow it, can understand that the aircraft is building speed, is approaching the point where it will fly. The 707's acceleration was categorically different. The four jets, once released from the brakes, pushed the aircraft with a force that passengers described with the same word, over and over again across dozens of testimonies from the era. Brutal. Not dangerous, not wrong. Brutal. The sense of being moved by something that didn't negotiate, didn't build gradually, but simply decided to go and went. The rate of climb after liftoff was equally disorienting. Propeller transports climbed at rates that passengers could relate to their visual experience of the ground. You rose, and you could watch the ground fall away at a pace that felt connected to the speed you'd felt on the runway. The 707's climb was at a rate that seemed disconnected from any civilian experience passengers possessed. The ground fell away faster than made instinctive sense. Several passengers from that era described looking out the window during initial climb and having the strange, specific sensation of being in something that was moving in a direction that flight wasn't supposed to move. Not forward and gently upward, as their bodies expected, but upward, forcefully, as though the aircraft had decided that altitude was urgent. And then, the quiet. Or rather, what felt like quiet compared to the propeller engine environment passengers knew. At cruise altitude, the 707's cabin was dramatically less noisy than the propeller aircraft it replaced. This sounds obviously like an improvement. It was an improvement. But for passengers whose understanding of flight included the constant mechanical conversation of four piston engines as a form of reassurance, as evidence that the aircraft was working, was running, was present and effortful in its management of their survival, the relative quiet of the jet was deeply unnerving. Several passengers from the early jet era have described with some embarrassment and a great deal of consistency that the reduced noise felt like something had stopped, like the aircraft had ceased its effort, like the sounds that had always told them everything was normal had simply gone away. The speed at altitude produced its own psychological dislocation. Passengers who had learned to read their progress across a map by the comfortable correspondence between time elapsed and miles covered found that the 707's velocity made those calculations feel wrong. You looked down at the ocean or the continent below, and the rate of geography was passing seemed to exceed what an airplane was supposed to be able to do. Some passengers found this exhilarating. Many found it profoundly unsettling, not because speed was inherently frightening, but because it exceeded the frame of reference within which their understanding of flight had been built. The landing approach produced the final installment of strangeness. The 707 came in faster than anything passengers had experienced. The approach angle was steeper. The rate of descent in the final miles to the runway generated a sinking sensation in the stomach that propeller aircraft approaches rarely produce with the same intensity. And the ground came up to meet the aircraft at a speed that for passengers watching through windows required a genuine act of trust. trust that the aircraft and the pilots knew something that the passenger's body was emphatically disputing. All of these things were safe. Every one of them was designed, tested, certified, and managed by professionals who understood them completely. The fear they generated had no relationship to actual danger. It had every relationship to the profound gap between what passengers had been prepared to experience and what the 707 actually delivered. The fear that surrounded the early 707 was not evenly distributed. It landed differently on different people, shaped by what they knew, what they'd experienced, and how much their professional identity was bound up in the composure they were expected to maintain. For ordinary passengers, the businessmen and tourists and families who bought tickets on Pan American or TWA in 1958 and 1959, the fear was permitted, even expected. Newspapers of the era covered jet travel with a mixture of enthusiasm and barely concealed alarm that gave passengers cultural permission to be nervous. Columnists wrote about jet lag before anyone had named it. Travel writers described the acceleration of jet takeoff with adjectives that range from thrilling to violent. The social conversation around first jet flights had a confessional quality. People talked about their nerves, shared their white-knuckle moments, compared the sensations they'd experienced with the sensations their friends described. Being frightened by the 707 was not shameful. It was, in a specific social sense, fashionable. The cabin crews occupied a more complicated position. Stewardesses of the early jet era were trained to project absolute composure, to be, for nervous passengers, the living evidence that nothing unusual was happening. Their training programs in the late 1950s added specific modules on managing jet anxiety, on the language to use when passengers grabbed armrests during takeoff, on how to discuss the engines in terms that were reassuring rather than technical. Several veterans of that training describe it as being taught to perform a kind of institutional calm that didn't necessarily reflect what they felt personally. Many of them had not flown jets before their airline training. Their first experiences of the 707's power were not in comfortable seats in civilian clothing, but in uniform, responsible for the composure of the passengers around them, expected to smile through sensations that their bodies were registering with genuine alarm. The stories they tell are specific and human in ways that formal histories rarely capture. One flight attendant who began her career on early Pan American 707 services described her first full-power takeoff, the engines building to a roar that she had been intellectually prepared for but was not physically prepared for, and the effort it required to keep her face neutral, her posture relaxed, her hands visible and still at her sides, while every instinct she had was suggesting that visible stillness was not the appropriate response to what was happening. She described looking down the cabin at the passengers, many of them gripping their armrests, many of them wide-eyed, some of them with their eyes closed, and feeling alongside the alarm a specific professional responsibility that she says was actually what got her through it. They needed her to be fine, so she was fine. The pilots had their own version of this, shaped by a professional culture that made the expression of fear even less available as an option. The captains who flew the 707's early commercial services were overwhelmingly experienced aviators, men with thousands of hours, military backgrounds, years of propeller transport flying that had given them a professional identity built on unflappability. The 707 had challenged that identity during training in ways that many of them processed privately and never discussed publicly. By the time they were flying passengers, they had worked through the worst of their adaptation. But the early months of line flying, the first few hundred hours on the type, when the aircraft's behavior was still not fully second nature, required a performance of confidence that was occasionally more performance than confidence. One retired captain, speaking at an aviation history event decades after his 707 career ended, described what he called the gap, the space between what he knew intellectually about the aircraft's safety and what his hands wanted to do during certain maneuvers in the early months. The gap, he said, was not large, but it was real, and managing it, flying with authority while the body was still integrating information that the mind had already accepted, was, he thought, the most demanding thing the 707 asked of its early crews. Not the technical demands of the aircraft itself, but the psychological demand of performing mastery before mastery was fully achieved. For the mechanics and ground crews, the fear took a different form, one rooted in responsibility rather than physical sensation. The men who serviced the 707 in those first years were in many cases transitioning from piston backgrounds. They knew jet engines from training, from manuals, from the careful accumulation of classroom and hangar knowledge. But the gap between knowing and knowing, between conceptual understanding and the deep familiarity that allows a mechanic to put a hand on a cowling and feel whether something is wrong, that gap existed for them too. And their version of it came with the specific weight of knowing that the aircraft they were clearing for service would be carrying people who had placed their lives in the competence of everyone in that maintenance chain. Several veteran DC mechanics from that era described a heightened vigilance in the early years of 707 maintenance, not a paralyzing anxiety, but a sustained alertness, a refusal to assume, a compulsion to verify that was somewhat more intense than what their propeller experience had established as normal. They were afraid, in the particular way that responsible people are afraid, not of the aircraft itself, but of their own possible inadequacy in relation to it. The terror of the early 707 left a legacy that is, in its own way, one of the most remarkable outcomes of the entire jet age. It built a modern aviation safety culture. The specific fears of 1958 about jet engine reliability, about structural integrity at high altitude, about pilot training adequacy, about the adequacy of regulations designed for propeller aircraft to govern jet operations, drove investments in safety infrastructure that were, in retrospect, foundational. The FAA updated its certification standards. Airlines rebuilt their training programs from the ground up. Maintenance procedures were formalized and regularized in ways that piston-era operations had not required. Simulator technology, which would eventually become the cornerstone of commercial airline training worldwide, was driven in its early development by the specific demands of teaching pilots to handle jet emergencies without putting actual aircraft and passengers at risk. The fear, in other words, was productive. It demanded answers, and the aviation industry, to its considerable credit, provided them, not instantly, not without difficulty, but systematically and durably enough that the level of safety achieved in commercial jet aviation over the subsequent decades represents one of the genuine engineering triumphs of the 20th century. The passengers who were terrified in 1958 and 1959 became passengers within a few years who were entirely habituated to jet travel. Their children grew up never knowing another kind of commercial flight. Their grandchildren boarded aircraft without a second thought, carrying luggage onto jets that are incomparably more powerful than the 707 was, sitting in seats that are moving at speeds their grandparents genuinely found terrifying, experiencing nothing more remarkable than mild irritation at the boarding process. That normality, that complete, taken for granted, utterly unremarkable normality, is the 707's deepest legacy. Not the aircraft itself, but the world it made possible. A world in which the terrifying became routine, in which speed became invisible, in which the future, once confronted and survived, became simply the present. The terror of the early 707 left a legacy that is, in its own way, one of the most remarkable outcomes of the entire jet age. It built the modern aviation safety culture. The specific fears of 1958 about jet engine reliability, about structural integrity at high altitude, about pilot training adequacy, about the adequacy of regulations designed for propeller aircraft to govern jet operations, drove investments in safety infrastructure that were, in retrospect, foundational. The FAA updated its certification standards. Airlines rebuilt their training programs from the ground up. Maintenance procedures were formalized and regularized in ways that piston-era operations had not required. Simulator technology, which would eventually become the cornerstone of airline pilot training worldwide, was driven in its early development by the specific demands of teaching pilots to handle jet emergencies without putting actual aircraft and passengers at risk. The fear, in other words, was productive. It demanded answers, and the aviation industry, to its considerable credit, provided them. Not instantly, not without difficulty, but systematically and durably enough that the level of safety achieved in commercial jet aviation over the subsequent decades represents one of the genuine engineering triumphs of the 20th century. The passengers who were terrified in 1958 and 1959 became passengers within a few years who were entirely habituated to jet travel. Their children grew up never knowing another kind of commercial flight. Their grandchildren board aircraft without a second thought, carrying luggage onto jets that are incomparably more powerful than the 707 was, sitting in seats that are moving at speeds their grandparents genuinely found terrifying, experiencing nothing more remarkable than mild irritation at the boarding process. That normality, that complete, taken for granted, utterly unremarkable normality, is the 707's deepest legacy. Not the aircraft itself, but the world it made possible. A world in which the terrifying became routine, in which speed became invisible, in which the future, once confronted and survived, became simply the present. We began with a woman at the end of a runway considering getting off the plane. She stayed, she flew, she arrived. And I've been thinking about her and about the millions of people like her, the passengers who gripped armrests in 1958 and 1959, the cabin crews who smiled through their own alarm, the pilots who performed confidence they were still in the process of earning, the mechanics who checked and rechecked their work with a vigilance born from the weight of what they were responsible for. What they were doing without knowing it was something that every generation is called to do at some point, confronting something genuinely new and genuinely powerful, something that exceeded the frame of reference that experience had given them, and choosing to trust it anyway. Not blindly, not without reservation, but enough to stay on the plane, enough to do the job, enough to sign the maintenance release, enough to smile at the passenger in seat 14A who was gripping the armrest and needed someone to demonstrate that this was survivable. The 707 was terrifying at first because it was real, because it was genuinely new and genuinely powerful, and genuinely beyond what human experience had prepared anyone to encounter. The fear was not a failure of nerve, it was evidence of sanity, of people correctly perceiving that something unprecedented was happening. What happened next, the mastery, the habituation, the eventual boredom with something that had once been almost unbearable in its intensity, is the part of the story that rarely gets told. But it's the most human part, the part where the terrifying becomes the familiar, where the future becomes the present, where a child presses her face against an airport window and watches jets with nothing in her eyes but delight.